We've had a phenomenal year throughout the SCUP program, and I think the secret to kind of growing and scaling impact is collaboration.
To both project leaders and to experts, we ask them, please join us and get involved with the SCALE program.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I hope everybody is equipped and that you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes. Minister, you are okay?
Yeah, we good.
You listen. Very good. Great pleasure for me to launch this discussion. It's a beautiful place. The weather is not too bad. And we are going to discuss very important topics, of course. So welcome to the Paris Peace Forum. And I suggest we start the discussion. We will have Mabel Miao, Gareth Evans, Hinna Rabani-Carr, and Lynn Kwok, all very distinguished speakers, to discuss something like a world order through Chinese lens. And so I think it's relevant to start with Mabel Miao, who's going to tell us about the Chinese view. Please, Mabel.
Thank you, Michelle. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here once again. Actually, on such exciting topic, especially the topic of this session, should be and must be with the question mark ended by question mark. I will explain that later. It has been 80 years since the Bretton Woods system has established. The Bretton Woods system is significant as it has brought prosperity and peace to the world over 80 years. So it is a success from this angle. So far, there have been the wars, local wars, but there's no big wars happening like the Third World War. With the rise of China and the other BRICS countries, the world has changed, translationing from the unipolar to the multipolar world. For example, in terms of the purchasing power parity, the GDP of BRICS has surpassed that of G7. Actually, China has never claimed there's global order with Chinese characteristics. It only can be said that China has a need and would like to improve, enhance the current existing global order, would like to contribute and improve it into that make it more balanced and more inclusive or fairer one. And actually, China has benefited from the current existing global order. China safeguards and support the WTO, World Bank, IMF, and the United Nations, of course, all those existing institutions. China is not seeking to overthrow or challenge the existing international system. Rather than China initiated Belt and Road initiatives and building a community with shared future through the major three global initiatives on the security, development, and civilization, which advocate for the sustainable development align with the United Nations SDGs and seek to the new approach to security that call for the non-interference and multilateral cooperation, of course, and the so-called global common security. Also advocates for that the intercultural dialogue and respect for civilization in diversity. So I think China believes the global order should be centered on the multilateralism in priority. Right now we see that the unilateralism is in the rise. It is important than ever. The multilateralism and multilateral institutions, China safeguards United Nations as the core institution of the global governance, also safeguards international laws, safeguards the international relation norms based on the United Nations Charter's principle and proposes. So I think from this angle, China is safeguards the international and the multilateral institutions. Second, I think China always emphasizes economic cooperation. This is China's belief on the global context. The economic cooperation is a very, very important part, while we see in the rise group like the Quad, AUKUS, even NATO, they prioritize is that the military concern. While China emphasized on the economic cooperation, we know China initiated Belt and Road Initiative over 1 decade, already invested more than $1 trillion through 3,000 projects in the global countries, benefit the grassroots in global south countries benefited from that pragmatic projects. China also launched the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and participated the RCEP and seek to participate CPTPP. Also, China organized all the various economic summits with African, Latin American, ASEAN, and all the Central Asia and all the countries, of course, with Africa. So China is actively in those multilateral platform for economic development, fostering the infrastructure development and economic improvement and those grassroots and civil society community from China's development. Of course, the most important point I can offer is that China believes the global order should be and must be open and inclusive. As a founding member of BRICS, I guess later our panelists colleagues will mention the BRICS later. BRICS is a very open and inclusive platform, already demonstrated the value of that openness and inclusiveness without the ideologic exclusivity. China and the other BRICS members open the door to all the countries who committed to mutual respect and dialogue and economic cooperation. So I think BRICS is not so-called and platform anti-West bloc. It should be a new platform, and the developing countries' experience enable the developing countries, especially the global south, to engage in the global governance. So in conclusion, I think what China wants, I think China wants the world, the global order, to be more inclusive, more open, and more balanced, and make the global south countries' perspectives and their opinions and their values be respected and be represented.
Thank you very much, Mabel, and thank you very much to respecting the time frame. I'll come back to you later on, but maybe let's turn to Minister Gareth Evans. Gareth, can you tell you something about the middle powers, which obviously are a new factor, a new class of actors in the world? Now that it's more complicated than to say they are the developing world and the developed world, there are a third category of countries which are important, have some leverage, but to which extent?
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for the opportunity to talk to you and to you all. I really do think it's a little romantic to think that the middle powers, and I'll come to the definition of middle powers in a moment, either individually or collectively, could ever have the kind of capacity to shape the world order that is exercised by the great powers, by China and by the United States. Equally, I think it's also true that it's a little bit romantic to think that we could exercise the capacity to influence on a significant but lesser scale. It's exercised by the countries that we tend to call the great powers, the second tiers, the Indias, the Russias. They can exercise a degree of real influence regionally and to some extent globally, which I think are of a different order than us lesser characters are able to do. That said, I think middle powers can have an important impact on what goes on in the wider world, but it's more likely to be on individual issues involving what might be called niche diplomacy rather than being across the board. That said, some of those niche issues can be of really much greater than niche significance. And let me give you some examples of middle power influence at work, going back not just recently, but quite some decades. In fact, from Australia's point of view, Dr. Evatt, our then Foreign Minister, played a very big role in the actual creation of the United Nations in 1945. His fight for the rights of the smaller powers against the great powers in the respective roles of the Security Council and the General Assembly was very influential, as was his faith in the United Nations as an agent for social and economic reform and as a protector of human rights, rather than just being a vehicle for peace and security. There was also the role of Australia as a quintessential middle power, I guess, in initiating Asia-Pacific dialogue mechanisms like APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. The role that we played in very close cooperation with France in getting established the Antarctic ban on prohibition of mining in Antarctica, finalising the Chemical Weapons Treaty. There was the role of Australia again working with Indonesia, another quintessential middle power, to craft and to drive the Cambodian peace settlement towards the end of the Cold War and in the early 90s. There was the role of Nigeria as a middle power in leading many effective conflict response efforts in West Africa. There was the role of Canada, of course, in initiating the International Treaty for the Prohibition of Landmines. There was the role of Norway in initiating the prohibition of cluster bombs. There was the role of Mexico and others in initiating the Nuclear Ban Treaty. There's the role of Canada and Australia and South Africa working together to initiate and achieve global consensus on the responsibility to protect against mass atrocity crimes, R2P. There was the role of a whole cooperating constellation of middle powers in forging the very path-setting European Green Deal on climate change. There's the determination of Brazil, another classic middle power, Brazil's President Lula, to lead a southern charge on climate action at the forthcoming or present and forthcoming COP conferences. So there's lots and lots of things on the record for the sort of contribution that middle powers working together and initiating initiatives can take. There's no agreed definition of middle powers. To me, they're best described as simply those states, and there's many of them around the world, which objectively are not economically or militarily big enough or strong enough to impose their policy preferences on anyone else. Certainly not globally, and at best only occasionally regionally. but which are nonetheless sufficiently capable, sufficiently credible in terms of the perception of others, and sufficiently motivated to be able to make some impact on international relations. What, to me, I think matters most in identifying middle powers is not any particular objective measure of size, whether you're talking about GDP or population or land mass or defence expenditure or anything else. I mean, for example, Norway would be on just about everyone's list of as an effective middle power, but only ranks about 120th in the world in population terms. There's also a lot of, when you look at these lists of middle powers, there's a lot of overlap in perceptions between those who count as middle powers and those who count as major powers, even if there's no overlap with the great powers. To me, I think the best definition of middle powers, even though it's a tiny bit circular, is the effectiveness with which they practice what I like to call middle power diplomacy. And what's the characteristics of middle power diplomacy as distinct from other forms of diplomacy? I think it has a particularly characteristic motivation and a characteristic method. The characteristic motivation of middle power diplomacy is a belief in the utility and the necessity of acting cooperatively with others in addressing international challenges, particularly those global public goods challenges, problems, which by their nature cannot be solved by any country acting alone, however big and powerful. And the characteristic diplomatic method of middle power diplomacy is, of course, coalition building with like-minded states. Those who, whatever their prevailing value systems or ideological systems, do share specific interests and are prepared to work together to do something about advancing those interests. It's never easy to craft such coalitions across geographical and cultural and ideological divides. It never has been easy. But I remain confident from the experience of the past that the need to craft those coalitions in the current environment is still very well recognised, and there still exists the will and the capacity to do so. But it will require, as ever, strong leadership. Coalitions don't build themselves, they have to be forged, and that does require effective leadership. So although I think middle powers can make an effective contribution to the world order, whether it's dominated by China or the United States or anyone else, I don't think we can realistically play a role in shaping that world order. But that doesn't mean we're irrelevant, and I hope that I've demonstrated that capacity for relevance still.
Thank you very much, Gareth. It was a very clear presentation. Your contribution to the definition of middle powers, I think it's great. Although I don't agree with you on the beginning of your presentation about what the middle powers can do, but we'll be back on that later on. Hina, now the notion of global south has acquired some legitimacy over the last years in the public debate, even though some people are very skeptical about it. So in your view, does the global south exist, what it is, and what does global south want in terms of global order?
Okay, so without wanting to go too deeply into nomenclatures, whether to call it the developing world or the global south or the leftovers or the rest versus the West, without spending time or wasting time in nomenclatures, I think the question, if I may be provocative and say, is a bit ill-placed because we are, as humanity, part of the globe. And there is supposed to be the preservers and propagators of an order which can work for everyone. Now that order has certain requirements to be met before you can call it order and not let it descend into chaos. What I see around the world is very few preservers. The traditional preservers of order are now have become the challengers of the same order. And if you want examples of that, you can see examples in the WTO, you can see examples in the UN itself, in the United Nations itself. So when you talk about order, or what is the order, where is the order, there is nothing that represents the order of multilateralism more than the United Nations, right? As we speak, if you look around the world, and you look around the United Nations, and a lot of people love to say, oh, the United Nations has failed. The United Nations has absolutely not failed. What has failed is the countries who hold seat in the Security Council to hold the UN and allow the UN to do what it is trying to do. So for instance, when you look at the United Nations Secretary General, he's not failed from telling the world what needs to be done in the Middle Eastern conflict. He's not failed to tell us that we need ceasefire immediately. He's not failed to tell us that this is for the first time, or not the first time, that this is the largest number of journalists, children who have been massacred without authorization of using violence by the Security Council. That is not legal, right? And yet, countries and preservers of order who have hectored, lectured, and sanctioned countries at much less sit pretty in the seat and use their veto against ceasefire rather than force ceasefire. So I'm just trying to stretch a view of the world that is coming from the rest, from what you call the global south, I may call the developing world, I may call the leftovers, or these are basically countries which are still struggling with basic stuff such as sustainable development goals, which are still struggling with being able to put everybody to school, which are still struggling, in fact not still struggling, but are actually paying the cost of industrialization disproportionately on climate change. Countries like mine in 2022 went through floods which is catastrophic, right? Now we are just contributors about 1% to global emissions, and why are we on the receiving end of such massive result? And what are we doing as the leadership of the world and all of us who are trying to go for, preservers of order? What are we doing? Have we agreed on differentiated responsibility on climate change? Have we agreed on what are going to be the new regulations on AI or on laws, which is lethal autonomous weapons of mass destruction, or on all of the issues, or on pandemics? How did we deal with it, right? So it's really interesting to be viewing the world from what you call the global south, and to see everybody wanting not to compete for leadership role, but to continue the preservation of hegemonic power in some ways, right? So I think this whole construct right now, where everybody is trying to tell us, oh, we are the preservers of the rules-based order, when we are also the killers in some ways, and we literally are the ones who are breaking it down with our behavior. So I said this last time I was here at the Paris Peace Forum, that people have ears, but they also have eyes. So when what you say is so different than what you do, then the 3 or 4 prerequisites of anyone who is seen to be a leader in the world is that they should be, first of all, whatever they say are their values should be universally applicable. So whether it's in Gaza or in Ukraine or anywhere else or in Africa, Sub-Saharan or Pakistan, India, universally. 1. 2, that they're credible. So if they say they do something, they actually do it. 3, they're predictable, which is also kind of related. So on all of those counts, I would say that when the West or the preservers of order are not looking very pretty right now, they're not very credible, they're not predictable. So that the South, the global South, or the rest, whatever you want to call them, is currently not in a very, not very excited to follow anyone, because no one is offering that leadership at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Speaker. Very clear view. Now, Lin Kwok, the BRICS are becoming a kind of official voice of the global South. But in the same time, among the BRICS, you have Russia, which is not exactly in the South, and you have China, and you heard Mabel explaining that China is a BRICS country among others. It may be true, but in the same time, it's also half of the GNP, the collective GNP of the BRICS. So there is a kind of a paradox in having among the BRICS middle powers from the South and at least 2 powers which can be described as major powers or great powers, whatever you want to say, which are not exactly of the same type of other middle powers from the South. So how is it possible that the BRICS could be the voice of the global South or of the middle powers, by the way?
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first Paris Peace Forum, so it's wonderful to be able to join everyone in the room as well as other panelists. I think I'd start by stating that the term Global South, which has gained popularity and salience in the last couple of years, refers now less to countries from a specific region or location, or even socio-economic level, and more perhaps to countries with perhaps very little in common, save a degree of grievance against the West or a sense that some of their needs have not been addressed by the West. So, you know, whether or not it's, as you sort of suggest, it's a paradox that Russia and China are members of this club matters less than the fact that there have been other countries who have voluntarily sought to join it, notwithstanding Chinese and Russian membership, and perhaps even because of Chinese and Russian membership, because particularly in the case of China, China brings geopolitical and geoeconomic clout. Now, you also mentioned that the BRICS has become an official voice of the Global South. I don't think I would agree with that. And this is notwithstanding the fact, I don't think we can say there is one official voice from the Global South, right? And despite the increase in members in BRICS, as well as the increase in partner countries in BRICS, I don't think anyone in the Global South has anointed the BRICS its official voice. I think, you know, there has been some hand-wringing in the West about what BRICS means, perhaps for an anti-West coalition. We saw Putin's statement at the summit in Russia just a month or so ago, and that was clearly targeted at the West. But if we look at the joint statement issued by countries, I think that was far more moderate and put an emphasis on multilateralism. And so, you know, perhaps some might argue, oh, that's Chinese talk, etc. But that's in essence nothing wrong with multilateralism. And in fact, that is something that should be encouraged. The fact that that came out of a BRICS statement shouldn't be feared. I think it should, in fact, be encouraged. If we look at the recent countries who have sought, the countries in my part of the world, Southeast Asia, countries who have sought to join the BRICS as partners, they have not been motivated to join BRICS by a desire to join an anti-West group. Instead, they've been motivated by a desire to hedge against particularly against the vagaries of US-China competition. So they're trying to create additional economic as well as strategic options for themselves. They have also been motivated by a desire to enhance their voice and standing on the regional and international stage. In the case of Malaysia, one could argue that Malaysia is also seeking to signal a degree of displeasure at the West in terms of, particularly the United States, in terms of how it's handled the Israel-Gaza conflict. But even in the case of Malaysia, I think there is no country that, at least in my part of the world, that has sought to join to create an anti-West coalition. They are seeking to create more options for themselves. That said, I think it's really important that countries in BRICS, remember, if their goal is countries in BRICS who do not want to create an anti-West coalition, they should be very careful about managing anti-Western rhetoric in BRICS, particularly their own. So they can't necessarily control what others say, but they can control what they say. And so I think, you know, hopefully moving forwards, we'll see these countries manage rhetoric in the grouping, but also their own rhetoric more carefully. I also hope to see these newer members or partners of BRICS actually seek to build bridging ties between BRICS as well as some of the traditionally more perceived as more pro-Western groupings such as G7. So I think the bridges between some of these groupings are important if we are not to see the world divide into opposing blocs. And I just wanted to loop back briefly to the question of, you know, a global order with Chinese characteristics. And I think BRICS is but one means by which China might seek to create a world order with Chinese characteristics, but insofar as bolstering Chinese influence is concerned, that I don't think has been the most important tool, and I think that tool has been economic engagement. We've seen sustained economic engagement by China in various parts of the world. It's the #1 trading partner of many countries in Asia. It's the #2 investment partner of many countries in Asia. And its Belt and Road Initiative has undeniably, despite criticism in much of the media, resulted in tangible outcomes for countries in the region, including high-speed rails in Indonesia as well as Laos. And I think this has shown in terms of perceptions of China in my part of the world, when respondents were asked in an annual poll about who they would align with if they had to choose between the United States and China. This was the first year in which the majority of respondents actually selected China over the United States. It was by a marginal amount, but nonetheless it was significant because particularly in the Muslim majority countries, the numbers selecting China over the United States increased by 20 percentage points. So I think, this has been a result of, #1, the movement towards China has been, if the countries are forced to choose, has been the result of, #1, sustained economic engagement by China, and #2, also, the flaws in U.S. engagement, the lack of U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia, as well as, its actions in the Middle East, which, for better or for worse, has been perceived as wholly unacceptable by countries in my part of the world. And let me just close by touching on whether a world order with Chinese characteristics is necessarily a bad thing. And I think that definitely depends on how China behaves in terms of adherence to international law. I think I'd go back to what Hina said earlier about people have ears, but they have also eyes. And in this respect, while much of Chinese action is salutary, I think its actions in the South China Sea are very much problematic insofar as they clearly flout international law and are clearly also a thorn in the side of relations with neighboring countries who would otherwise truly desire closer relations with China. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Ling. Very, very interesting. Maybe I will start with you the following questions. Because you said very clearly why China was attractive for other powers, whatever the definition you give to them, middle powers or powers from the global south. Seen from Paris, of course, it would look like more natural to have a kind of coalition between middle powers of the south and middle powers of the north or of the west without the big ones, that is to say the US on one side and China and Russia on the other side. You seem to say, or you implicitly demonstrated that it's not the case, precisely because of the attraction of China. Could you clarify this point, please?
I don't think these are mutually exclusive options. I think what you just suggested, which is middle powers, perhaps excluding the great or superpowers, getting together both from the Western as well as non-Western worlds. That is, in fact, a recommendation that a council at the World Economic Forum that I'm part of has suggested.
Exactly, yes.
So I'm part of the Geopolitics Council, the Future of Geopolitics Council at the World Economic Forum. And one recommendation in the report that was issued earlier this year, was to have a sort of M10, and 10 is just an arbitrary number, middle power 10, which includes Western as well as non-Western middle powers who would come together and seek to ensure or encourage the United States and China to behave a little bit better and not to perhaps go into a collision clause, and also encourage better adherence to international law. Who those countries are, who those middle powers would be, I think would be open to question. But I think they should, at the very least, be concerned about. They should have a degree of visionary leadership, a commitment to diplomacy, and themselves also demonstrate a commitment to international law. So what I'm finding very uncomfortable are countries who are talking about the importance of international law in their region, but when it comes to other parts of the world, say in my part of the world, they talk about the importance of international law in the South China Sea, the importance of international law on the India-China border, but somehow when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's completely overlooked and forgotten. Yeah. So I think it's really important that the middle powers who seek to play a constructive role in shaping the global order, perhaps not decisively shaping it, but nonetheless contributing to and shaping the global order. It's really important that they have that commitment to international law as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe, Mabel, I'll be back to you. A lot of questions or a lot of references have been mentioned about China. Maybe we have to be very brief, and I understand my questions are very large, but first of all, how do you react to this interpretation of China being also looked as aggressive and not only a peaceful, contributing countries and so on, but able to put pressures on some part of the world? And maybe secondly, in your presentation, you insisted upon the willingness by China to improve the current world order, including in terms of security, and you mentioned the Security Council. Do you think that your country could favor an enlargement of the Security Council with new members, both from the permanent members, both from the South and from the West?
Thank you. I listened carefully what our panel colleague mentioned about China. Actually, this word, the current existing system, already be no longer capable of addressing the challenges we face, from the geopolitical tensions to the climate change to the health crisis, and plus China and the global South countries like BRICS, they want to end the positive experience. Let them try. As the reality is, the world is entered the multipolar world. We have to accept the reality. So from the unipolar to multipolar world, of course, there are many emerging institutions and those so-called frameworks. Let them try. It's contribute to the world for the peace and stability. For China, regarding those issues mentioned, I think most of those, from my observation, just provoked by the others, and China give the kind of reaction. Regarding the South China Sea, we can see China can get along with Malaysia, can get along with Indonesia. Why right now Philippines and some specific countries? I think because the military from U.S. set up the base attached in that place, so they have to align with that. So I think sometimes this is a reaction from China. I don't think China is so-called aggressive. Actually, Chinese society is a looking inwards society with that kind of characteristics. Sometimes we just call there's Chinese characteristics in the context of domestic economy development. China is not seeking to to contain or to challenge the so-called existing international order. Just want to improve it, along with, because of as the second largest economy, along with the rise of the other global South country rise. So I think let's accept the multipolar world.
The reform of the Security Council?
I'm not expert on that side, but I think China believes desperately the UN should be reformed according to the current situation.
Garrett, maybe you want to react to that, but my disagreement with you would be to say that the middle powers in the world of today are, to some extent, kingmakers. And I would give you a very simple example, which is war in Ukraine. the fact that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India are not applying sanctions which has been decided by the West makes a big difference. In practical terms, it allows Mr. Putin to continue the war. So is it not the case that the middle powers are the new kingmakers? With that limit, and on that point I'm with you, that they are not able to be also peacemakers.
Well, middle powers are not without influence, either by their acts or by their omissions. They can be significant players, but my point is essentially it's really only ever going to be at the margin, because the concept of middle powers somehow getting together, whether as a conference of democracies, a US aspiration, or whether it's the kind of aspiration that was mentioned before to gather up a team of middle power players to put the heat on China and the United States to behave better, I think that's chasing a will-o'-the-wisp. That's not the world that we live in. But let me just add a word in response to Mabel. Look, I think we have to acknowledge that China's international and domestic behaviour has not been entirely a thing of beauty. The South China Sea, we all understand China's aspirations to have its own strategic space. And we know how spooked the United States would be if it had submarines and warships going 12 nautical miles off the coast of San Diego, which is a daily reality for Chinese experience. So we understand that. But equally, it's perfectly clear, as Lynn has said, that you've just torn up international law in the context of the claims that you've been making territorially. And that's not something that is very attractive to many, many other countries around the world, who are quite right to call out the hypocrisy of the United States in particular in waving the flag of international law in some contexts but entirely ignoring it in others, like Gaza. But that doesn't make it any better for China. It's just adding to the store of hypocrisy. Look, I don't think, despite all of this and despite all the reservations and anxiety we might have about China's behaviour in Hong Kong, in Tibet with the Xinjiang and so on, I don't think we should be excessively spooked in the rest of the world by China. I mean, what China's doing is demanding its own strategic space, which is perfectly understandable. China's demanding a role as internationally, globally, as a rule maker, not just a rule taker. And that's absolutely to be understood and expected. I would have hoped that in that context, China would be playing a slightly more constructive role in the UN Security Council than it is at the moment. If you're claiming the absolute indispensability of the Security Council, then to be joining Russia as a spoiler on so many fronts as you are. So I've got mixed attitudes, and they're reflected in my own country and the countries of all our region who really want to walk both sides of the street in a balanced way. So I think you gilded the lily a bit, but on the whole, I think we should not be too spooked by what you're up to.
Exactly. Thank you very much, guys. Now we are running out of time, and I suggest that we give the last word to Hina. What are your conclusions after this very, very interesting debate?
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to draw conclusions from an interesting debate. I just say that I think it was a very informed discussion. And I think this, but one thing I do want to say, because Mabel, when you asked the question that, why is, you actually framed it like what the West decided to do to Ukraine, to Russia, what the West decided to do, and Turkey and India and everybody else did not play ball, right? And that was in some ways demonstrative of how middle powers or swing states or whatever you want to call them can have a role in upending the order, so to speak. But ask ourselves the question that what the West decided to do to Russia as opposed to what the international rules-based order decided to do to Russia is a good question to ask ourselves. And I think at the root of all of this, if you try and see what is really at the root of all the conversation that we're having, there's this one overlarge, outsized word, which is exceptionalism. Okay, so when you feel that rules apply to everyone else and everybody must follow the rules as they should, as they're written in the book, in the United Nations Charter, but us and our friends. And at many levels, this is really what is creating this world of unpeace that we're living in right now. It's really a world of a lot of chaos. And coming from the external eye as not the rule makers, but the rule takers, the forced rule takers, the world is seeming to be very, very dangerous. Because what is seeming to be the case is, if I feel like it, I will apply sanctions to you because you are not my friend. But when my friend also does exactly the same thing, I will use my veto power to protect them. That's a very scary world. And I will just go out on a limb and say this, that yes, the world was never fair, but it has started to feel very, very unfair, very demonstrably, unhidingly nowadays, and that is having an impact on the legitimacy and the credibility of the rule makers. And I will just end by saying that I wish the West would start going back to what we are so inspired by the West from, which is their commitment to human rights, to universalization of the human rights. They're competing on the wrong wicket, so to speak. They're competing in the wrong areas. They're trying to emulate things which they tell us are bad things, right? And so really, I think the West or the rule makers need to start going back to leadership role to inspire people with values rather than raw muscle. Yeah?
Thank you, Hina. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I would have a lot of comments to do to your presentation, but I said that you will have the last word, so I have to keep my word myself. Thank you very much for this eminent panelist. Sorry to the audience that we didn't have time to put your questions, but probably you can continue the conversation after the end of the meeting. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.